Hey, Andrea, hey, Nicholas, hey, Jeremy. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hey, Christian. So given this is a 30-minute call, right, let's get started. I believe, there are a couple of folks who mentioned, they are traveling. So I think the two things which we do want to discuss is, Andrea, I think one is your revised comparison between the Qflow pipelines, Argo and Tecton. And then, Christian, let's go through, I would say the work in progress, design and specifications doc, and the further work you have done in terms of, updating the compiler, the Qflow pipeline compiler to generate Tecton pipelines. So with that, Andrea, do you want to go first and get started? So by the way, Jeremy is here, he's from the Qflow team. He leads the Qflow project. I asked him specifically for this meeting so that, we can get some feedback and hopefully, start getting a more community participation in this.
Okay. Okay, let me get the document, just a second.
If you're looking for the link, I have everything hyperlinked from the main GitHub repository, just in case.
Hi, everyone.
No, I think I got it. Just need to start sharing now. Share. Okay. Okay, hopefully this works. Can anyone see what I'm sharing right now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I just did the comparison again, this time starting from more of the KFP SDK side. So more the previous comparison was more centered in comparing Argo CD features against Tecton. Now I started from what is actually used in the compiler and mapped into what is on Argo side and what it could be on Tecton side. Of course, the compiler package, the first package, we know that there is a compiler for Argo, and there is a prototype compiler on Tecton, which is work in progress. So in terms of, just go through the list here. So in terms of, there are some functionality to create a container operation in the SDK from a Python function or load it from a file, and that is easily implemented in Tecton. So that's that would be a task on Tecton side. So in terms of container operation, I think there is a good support on Tecton side. One thing that we don't have, but there is a workaround, is the set image pool secret. Actually, we may have discussed adding it to the task directly. The way Tecton handled this is by specifying a service account which has the required image pool secret attached. So that would be the way to do it in Tecton today. So also in terms of parameters, I think we have good supports, components, pipeline, decorator. The typing is handled by annotation. That is also possible in Tecton. So there are three items, which are the resource operation, the volume operation, and volume snapshot operation, which use a native functionality on Argo pipeline side, Argo workflow side, which is the resource template. There's not such a thing on Tecton side, but it's easy to use a task, a dedicated task to do this. In fact, Tecton has a catalog of tasks that are like usable tasks. And one way forward would be to define those tasks in the catalog. We are also working on extra features that will allow us to point to a catalog in the task by reference, for instance, so that it doesn't need to be imported first into your cluster. So we could just reference to it, and that would make the compiler work even easier. So I'm just going through. If there are questions, feel free to stop me anytime.
So one question here on this side, Andrea, like this resource catalog you're talking about, or the
Yes.
task catalog. Have you looked at the components, the concept of components within Qflow pipelines, right? And typically, so beyond the compiler and all these things working perfectly, one thing at some point we will also need to address is the components which we are creating for Qflow pipeline, which are essentially Docker containers, but there is a components.yaml file which defines the input, the output, the backing Docker image for this component. If we can start doing that in a generic way as well, so that they can be reusable across both Tecton as well as Qflow pipeline, right? And so I don't know whether that's something
Yes, so that's absolutely. So that's I think in terms of SDKs is implemented as load component from YAML, for instance, which is on line 8. And yeah, so that can be mapped into Tecton tasks. So I mean, from the SDK point of view, the component is loaded from a file, and that would be the same format, I believe, regardless whether it's Argo or Tecton. So we could have the same component format, and then it would compile into an Argo workflow image or a Tecton task. Something that we are working, experimenting with right now is the ability to store tasks into the registry, so into the container image registry as artifacts, so you OCI format, and that would allow us to pull things like, for instance, components using a specific version, like a SHA, specific SHA, like it is done for container images, which I think is a nice functionality to have here.
Can I just ask you a question? I'm new here, so maybe this is the wrong question for this forum, but what is the reason to moving over to Tecton from Argo?
I can take that. I think it's not moving to Tecton from Argo. It's more like providing Tecton also as a target backend to run these pipelines. So I think specifically I can speak on behalf of IBM and Red Hat, right? So we have standardized on Tecton as the native CI/CD pipeline for the cloud, and that's the motivation on our side to ensure that if that's something which is already going to be embedded in OpenShift as a supported pipeline on our IBM cloud as a supported pipeline engine, the internal teams are requesting that for something like Qflow pipeline, it would make sense if it can run on top of Tecton rather than something like Argo, right? For which they will need to figure out getting people trained in that particular skill set and supporting that. So I think that's the primary motivation on our side. Jeremy, do you have any comments on the motivation from your side?
Yeah, so I think there's two. So I'm Jeremy. I work a lot on Kubeflow at Google. So I think there's two. I think this is just my 2 cents. So the first is, if you look at pipelines right now, Argo is not a first-class citizen. And so I think one thing that pipelines is missing is a well-defined resource model that provides a little bit more abstraction between the Python SDK and the actual underlying resources. And so I think, the one question is, should it be Argo? Should it be Tecton? Should it be some new, well-defined concept, new resource model, right? And so I think, NMS just mentioned pipelines defined its own sort of YAML, which for a component, which is basically the notion of a reusable task. Now that's something that I don't think Argo really had originally, but what it did have, Tecton did have that in the form of the task resource. And so I think to me, one of the questions is, does pipelines really need to introduce a new notion of a reusable task, or should it just be, could it just use, or that just use, a Tecton task? And then I think Argo, I haven't paid attention recently to Argo, but I think in the past year or so, they might have introduced something more akin to a task. I don't know. So maybe that gap has been closed, and so maybe that could be used in Argo. And then I think also just as Animesh says, certain companies are getting behind various solutions like Tecton. Like, so Google's heavily invested in Tecton as well. So I think from that perspective, we're aligning with a huge team at Google that's working on Tecton.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for the answer.
So if I can add something, it doesn't add too much, but from a Tecton community point of view, Tecton really aims to be like a common denominator in continuous delivery scenarios, which is CI/CD, but also delivery of machine learning artifacts. So I think there is a general willingness from the Tecton folks to integrate as much as possible with solutions on top of Tecton, and to be like common integration layer there. So I think that fits with that aim, that direction as well.
Yeah, and I think I will add to it. I mean, even Jenkins X, they are leveraging Tecton under the cover. So if you think or see, the trend, this cloud native CI/CD community is, aligning around Tecton. So I think it makes sense. I'm just looking at the time, Andrea, right? So if there are a couple of things you would want to call out, which you think are or can be long-term blockers in terms of getting the parity at a functionality level between Argo and Tecton, what would you say?
Long-term, not really. So the two things that are marked yellow, so the exit handler and the red one, the recursion. I think the exit handler is something that is actually really close. So it's been actively worked on, and we are very close to having that functionality. In parallel is under design. So we are discussing about it. So we're discussing whether to do it on task level, on step level, or both. So this is being designed, but I don't think it will be a long term to implement that. The only thing we have not talked about, and I'm not sure long term will be supported, is recursion. But so far, no one stood up and say, okay, recursion this is really something that is fundamental for machine learning.
Yeah. At this point, I would say, I mean, I haven't seen. I mean, 90% of the Kubeflow, 95% of the Kubeflow pipelines I have seen, recursion is not used. So I would say, that is one of those cases where we probably don't bother too much at this point. Things like, yes, volume op, volume snapshot, right? Exposing the native Kubernetes capabilities, running sequential parallel jobs, right? And being able to pass parameters, right? These are 4 or 5 things at top of that list.
So yeah, as I said, I don't see any long-term blocker here. So I think we are in a rather good position.
Thanks, Andrea. So please keep on updating this, right? And we'll, as we move through some of this work, right, we'll keep on prioritizing some of these requirements. We find out, which should be in Tecton. With that, Christian, do you want to share your screen and let's do a quick walkthrough of what you have been up to, all right? And Jeremy, Christian and Andrea, right? So Andrea is our Tecton committer. He works from IBM in the Tecton community. Christian works with us on the Kubeflow side of the house.
Yeah. Did you say there was a question for me?
I was just informing, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to go ahead, Christian?
Yep. I'm trying to click through the Zoom share screen buttons. And it wants me to go to my system preferences. One sec. I don't know. Zoom up here.
I can share it at my end if you're having trouble.
Yeah. It wants me to quit Zoom and restart. I'll do that anyway. Maybe you can start with the Google Docs. Sorry, Animesh.
So while you rejoin, yeah. So I think what, Jeremy, this is something we discussed, right? So part of it was, essentially, yes, putting up a plan and figuring out first, the gaps in Tecton, which is needed for a full featured, Qflow pipeline, Tecton compatibility. So, that's an exercise which has been going on. The other thing is, which is essentially some of the requests which we are getting from, for example, from internal teams are more like, they just need the compiler, right? Because UI is a big piece of it. If you see the Qflow pipeline UI, it's heavily dependent on the Argo YAML, the way it is constructed, the way it is, displays the DAG, etc. Right? So I think that's an aside piece of work which will require, a pretty extensive investigation in general. But even beyond that, I think the minimum thing which, some of the teams we talked to, they wanted was, okay, I mean, in any case, a lot of the products have their own UI. So can we, take that compiler, generate the DSL and generate a Tecton equivalent, right? So that has been the main driver. So one of the discussions we have had was around, the mapping. So within the Qflow pipeline, there is the concept of steps which are backed by components, right? So that's a single one thing. Now, when you go to Tecton, there is task and then there are steps, right? So I think the first attempt which was done by Peng from China was essentially, mapping the steps from the Tecton to the Qflow pipeline steps, right? Which worked for a sequential scenario, but that broke the model for a parallel execution because, if you need to do parallel execution using Tecton, right, you need to elevate it at the level of task, right, which essentially is a collection of pods, right? So that's what, is one of the changes which Christian has been handling first, right? And then secondly, as he's working through it, right, he's rejigging the code so that, it's our initial set of instructions have been around, I'll just jump to, the items he has been looking at, right? So essentially, we were copying part of the compiler code here into the KFP Tecton repository, generating that sequential pipeline, which was mapped to the steps, right? So quite a few things wrong there, right? So he's been fixing it, adding, a way to actually take the KFP SDK and then, overlay the changes on top. The second thing is, essentially remapping from a step perspective in Tecton to back to tasks. And then, rewriting the instructions so that we can generate the sequential pipeline at a minimum and run it. And the next thing which he is looking at, which I think we are fairly confident to get it in a near future of time, is essentially being able to run parallel tasks as well, right? And then the focus will actually shift from there to actually look at output artifacts and how to share passing them, and that is looking at the workspace concept within Tecton. So I think in a nutshell, what I'm hoping is now at this point, right, once we get to a point where it's a little bit more streamlined instruction to actually be able to take the Qflow pipeline SDK, overlay the changes on top, plus be able to generate a sequential and a parallel pipeline, we can get a bit more involvement from the community, right? So that includes, possibly I want to include Jessie from the Qflow pipeline team and see, if she has any interest in collaborating on this side. Definitely get someone from Red Hat side as well to actually, collaborate on this work and expand the aperture a bit, right? Yeah. So want to get your thoughts and comments on this, Jeremy, and how do you suggest we start, expanding in terms of, getting a bit more folks involved in this? Yeah.
Thanks. I think this is really great. I'm certainly excited about Tecton. I mean, I think to me, I think the big question is, is there a way to start incrementally introducing Tecton into Kubeflow so that, people start seeing it and people start using it? And, because just replacing Kubeflow pipelines with Tecton's a pretty big task. So I think one thought that you might want to look into is like, I think fairing might be some low-hanging fruit in terms of starting to replace some of the functionality in fairing with Tecton. So as an example, fairing is basically a Python SDK that's firing off Canico jobs to build Docker containers. And so I think to me that's some pretty low-hanging fruit in terms of let's just replace that with a Tecton task. And then that gives us the huge advantage of we can leverage Tecton resources to sort of move files around in terms of preparing the context and mounting the context, pulling context from Git sources. And then that would be a low-hanging way of starting to get people using Tecton and Kubeflow, and then sort of push for more unification between pipelines and Tecton.
Okay, makes sense. I was conversing with Jinshi yesterday, right? We were actually discussing fairing a bit. Part of the reason is, in terms of, I think as you have asked, right, the roadmap, but in general, right, I wanted to see the applicability of our involvement in it vis-a-vis, the business drivers, or so to say. So I think the Tecton work probably will or can act as a business driver on that side, right?
Yeah.
So I will,
So,
I'll get together with Jinshi. I think that part, hopefully, we can cover with Jinshi and his team. They're back in China, and hopefully get him involved in this initiative as well. And then the actual compiler work we can continue pursuing here.
So yeah, I think if you look at fairing, the idea was basically, there's a linear pipeline of you have a preprocessor, you have a builder, and then you have a deployer. So I think that maps really well to having a notion of Tecton tasks or a catalog of Tecton tasks that can be used or swapped in for each of those steps. So you can have one Tecton task that is a preprocessor that converts a notebook. You can have another Tecton task that uses Canico versus BuildKit to actually build it. And then fairing sort of just becomes like a Python SDK on top of that. Some sugar for sort of managing that with pipeline, with Python as opposed to just doing raw YAML. And then that sort of merges those two pretty nicely, I think.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think one of the things which you mentioned regarding, the notebooks, that's something which we are doing internally. We have a Qflow pipeline component which can take a notebook and run it, and that component is essentially, has Peppermill under the covers, right? So that will also align, one of the things which I need to think is, so we have this catalog of Qflow pipeline components, right? So now when you talk about, the catalog of Tecton tasks, right, we will need to figure out how to do them in a generic way so that, they are reusable across both. You can take, KFP as is and run it as an Argo, because in the end, these are Docker containers, right? So if we be a little bit more intelligent about, constructing the metadata around it, hopefully we can reuse, in a consistent manner across both of them. Yeah. So Christian, you are here. Do you want to, is your sharing working now? Can you quickly check and just, show us where you are versus, the compiler effort?
Yeah, I can try again. Sorry about that. Okay, it's blocking my screen. Is this? I'm sharing the Google Doc right now. My entire screen being shared.
We can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, thanks. You walked through.
But you do share your entire screen, so you know that.
Yes, I've been careful not to share pictures of my wife and daughter here, but yes, that was the easiest. I had too many screens open. Thank you. Right. So I've been focused more on the very low level tasks of getting the Qflow pipeline, the KFP Tecton project that you may have seen into a shape that developers can collaborate on that, right? So if you go to Qflow KFP Tecton, it's a very small project still. It has a few samples and has the SDK. and the SDK part is the part that I've been working on. I have been doing, sorry about that was a step too far. I've been doing Python development for, you know, a couple of years now. I'm coming from a Java background, and I'm really keen on being able to, you know, go to GitHub, clone a project, and, you know, try it out and chip away. And that wasn't possible with this project before, mainly because you had to do things like, you know, get the Kubeflow pipelines project, you know, clone it somewhere locally, build it, copy the files from this particular KFP Tecton compiler over the Kubeflow pipeline project, you know, and then build the Kubeflow pipeline project, and then, you know, use it as you would use KFP, with the caveat that you basically eliminate the KFP functionality in terms of the compiler and now only produce Tecton. So I did make an effort to change a few things in this project and make it so that people can, you know, basically go and collaborate and not having to copy code around and worry about the versions of the KFP, of the KFP version that the original code was being copied from and copying that back. And that's just a headache, right? So in that, I think I have a PR open to make many of those changes, and now the steps are more streamlined. So typically with Python, you create your virtual environment, you have a pip install, you know, to get your project installed, and then you can run the tests from the command line, or you can run it in your IDE. And I separated as the command line executable for DSL compile. I created a DSL compile Tecton, so you can run it in parallel to your standard Kubeflow SDK compiler. This one generates the Tecton YAML, and then you can take that YAML and you know, give that to your Tecton cluster, right? And then, you know, get your Tecton task started with this command. So I think that these steps are fairly streamlined, and, you know, much more easy to understand and reproduce. And that's basically the work I've done so far. And then now that this project is in a shape that I think developers can collaborate on, come the actual improvements to the code, right? So going away from the mapping of Kubeflow operations or Kubeflow tasks, steps in the pipeline, to Tecton steps inside one task, and instead mapping the individual pipeline operations into a task so they can run in parallel. And we can then also make some progress on using workspaces and sharing data for input and output parameters. So this is where I am right now. The next bigger concern I have is how to stage that work in a way that we can feed it back into the Kubeflow pipeline SDK and compiler, and maybe in the future have it in a way that the Kubeflow pipeline SDK and compiler, they have a command line flag where you can say, I want to generate Tecton instead of the Argo YAML, and the code would all live in one repository. To get to that point, I've made an effort to make sure that the methods that we had to override to generate Tecton YAML, they follow the same project structure as in the Kubeflow pipelines SDK, or the same class names, same method names. And for now, I'm using Python monkey patches to basically, you know, dynamically link those overwritten methods into my local copy of the Kubeflow pipelines SDK. And so as of now, there's only 4 Python modules that we have overwritten.
Okay, thanks, Christian. I think we are at the end of the time. So I think just, so Jeremy, you know, what we are thinking at this point is, you know, once we get to the point where we are able to generate a parallel pipeline, run it, and then be able to, you know, share the output artifacts using the workspace mechanism, that's probably the time we want to get Jesse and team involved from the Kubeflow pipeline. And as Christian mentioned, right, align that so that, you know, we start working on a common goal that at some point we want to merge into the mainstream Kubeflow pipeline repo and give that option for a flag, right? So that's, I think there is going to be a milestone fairly soon where we will need to, you know, have a conversation with the Kubeflow pipeline team, right? So hopefully, you know, maybe in a couple of weeks or so, right? So I think that's something, you know, we are hoping you can facilitate on that side. And I also intend to get, you know, at that probably is also the right time to get Red Hat involved in as well, that, you know, this is something which can now start turning into something real.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks, Jeremy. I
Right.
do need, I do need a minute of your time, you know, for discussing vis-a-vis, you know, something vis-a-vis the announcement, right? So if you can stay on for a minute, I know there is this on-prem call. Yeah. Thanks, Krishan. Thanks,
Bye.
Andrea. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Animesh. Bye.
Yeah, bye. Okay, can you hear me, Jeremy?
Yep, I can hear you.
So, so yeah, vis-a-vis, you know, the mail I sent to Thea was more around, you know, the coordination. I know that, I mean, the technical part is done, right? I mean, she was talking about, yes, the main block, but in terms of, you know, having to coordinate across, you know, some of the blogs, plus, you know, if she's doing any press release, right? So that's what my main intent was, you know, there was not a mail forward. I had sent her a draft of the blog, right? Which now, given the time frame, we are going to, for the most part, right, we are going to publish, right? But I wanted to get her eyes on it, but I didn't hear anything back, right? So that's what I was asking you. You know, I can ping you the high level.
You sent a blog post for IBM, or
Yeah, that's more like, you know, our view on Qflow 1.0, right, and what we have been doing, right? So let me ping you the draft as well, and you know, but in general, the thing was, you know, what we wanted was we want to hyperlink to the main blog, right, which is coming from your side, so that's one thing I wanted from her is, you know, is there a standard URL to which, you know, which we can put in right now, so that, you know, when this goes live, you know, thou shall be able to we shall be able to point to. The other thing was, you know, do we need any other coordination? Because from her mail, it appeared, you know, she wanted to coordinate quite a bit of, you know, activities across orgs, right? But given that it is Thursday and Monday is when this is happening, right? So I'm a little bit, yeah. So let me ping you. I will ping you I pinged you the draft on the Qflow Slack, right? And just take a look through it. And if you can, you know, let me know that, you know, what will be the final URL of the blog or blogs coming from your side, so I can insert and embed, right? The editing team on our side is still, you know, doing some edits on this, right? So the final form factor will be a little different, right? But not too much different from the content which is there. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. Thanks for your time. Bye.